Hello there. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're well. And we continue today with our study of Plato's Republic, and we've arrived at Book 3. And before I get into the text, I'll just again give a brief review of Book 2 and a preview of Book 3. And Stephen asked, will I not understand if I didn't read the previous books? I would say, to understand fully, Stephen, you would need to read all the books, but I'll be honest with you, it definitely takes a couple of readings to understand Plato fully. So if you're just here for the journey, then welcome. But Plato requires many studies, I think, many go-throughs in order to get it down fully, because it's very complicated language and ideas. But I'll just give a quick review of what we covered in Book 2. There was a continuation of a discussion of justice and injustice from the end of Book 1, and then the dialogue moved on to concentrate on the principles of social organization, on civilized society, and the qualities required in the guardians, which is what we move into in Book 3. We continue with the ideas of education of the guardian class, and they deal with Plato deals with poetry, poetic education, musical education. Then he moves on to physical education, and then the book ends with him speaking more fully about the guardians and auxiliaries, the rulers, and their way of life. So all that's to come in Book 3. And as always, if you enjoy and value what I do here at Book Club, you can please like and subscribe to the channel, and you can support me in various ways. The easiest way would be to share the link with anyone who you think might be interested in Plato, or you could give a donation through PayPal, join the Patreon Book Club community, or in the super chats. But that's enough of that. Let's get into the Republic, Book 3. Morally, most existing poetry is unsuitable because in its representation of gods and heroes, it describes and so encourages various forms of moral weakness. So that's a way of introduction to the text. Book 3. Such then, I said, are the kinds of stories that I think future guardians should and should not hear about the gods from childhood on, if they are to honour the gods and their parents and not take their friendship with one another lightly. I'm sure we're right about that, at any rate. What if they are to be courageous as well? Shouldn't they be told stories that will make them least afraid of death? Or do you think that anyone ever becomes courageous if he is possessed by this fear? No, I certainly don't. And can someone be unafraid of death, preferring it to defeat in battle or slavery, if he believes in Hades full of terrors? If he believes in a Hades full of terrors? Not at all. Then we must supervise such stories and those who tell them, and ask them not to disparage the life in Hades in this unconditional way, but rather to praise it, since what they now say is neither true nor beneficial to future warriors. We must. Then we'll expunge all that sort of disparagement, beginning with the following lines. I would rather labour on earth in service to another, to a man who is landless with little to live on, than be king over all the dead. And also these. He feared that his home should appear to gods and men, dreadful, dank, and hated even by the gods. And, alas, there survives in the halls of Hades a soul, a mere phantasm, with its wits completely gone. And this, and he alone could think, the others are flitting shadows. And the soul, leaving his limbs, made its way to Hades, lamenting its fate, leaving manhood and youth behind. And these, his soul went below the earth like smoke, screeching as it went. And, as when bats in an awful cave fly around, screeching if one of them falls from the cluster on the ceiling, all clinging to one another, so their souls went screeching. We'll ask Homer and the other poets not to be angry if we delete these passages and all similar ones. It isn't that they aren't poetic and pleasing to the majority of hearers, but that, the more poetic they are, the less they should be heard by children or men who are supposed to be free and to fear slavery more than death. Most certainly. And the frightening and dreadful names for the underworld must be struck out, for example, Cocytus and Styx, and also the names for the dead, for example, those below, and the sapless ones, and all those names of things in the underworld that make everyone who hears them shudder. They may be all well and good for other purposes, but we are afraid that our guardians will be made softer and more malleable by such shudders, and our fear is justified. Then such passages are to be struck out? Yes. And poets must follow the opposite pattern in speaking and writing? Clearly. Must we also delete the lamentations and pitiful speeches of famous men? We must, if indeed what we said before is compelling. Consider, though, whether we are right to delete them or not. We surely say that a decent man doesn't think that death is a terrible thing for someone decent to suffer, even for someone who happens to be his friend. We do say that. Then he won't mourn for him as for someone who has suffered a terrible fate? Certainly not. We also say that a decent person is most self-sufficient in living well and, above all others, has the least need of anyone else. That's true. Then it's less dreadful for him than for anyone else to be deprived of his son, brother, possessions, or any other such things. Much less. Then he'll least give way to lamentations and bear misfortune most quietly when it strikes. Certainly. We'd be right then to delete the lamentations of famous men, leaving them to women, and not even to good women either, and to cowardly men, so that those we say we are training to guard our city will disdain to act like that. That's right. Again then, we'll ask Homer and the other poets not to represent Achilles, the son of the goddess, living now on his side, now on his back, now again on his belly, then standing up to wander distracted this way and that on the shore of the unharvested sea, nor to make him pick up ashes in both hands and pour them over his head, weeping and lamenting in the ways he does in Homer, nor to represent Priam, a close descendant of the gods, as entreating his men and rolling around in dung, calling upon each man by name. And we'll ask them even more earnestly not to make the gods lament and say, "Alas, unfortunate that I am, wretched mother of a great son." But if they do make the gods do such things, at least they mustn't dare to represent the greatest of the gods as behaving in so unlikely a fashion as to say, "Alas, with my own eyes I see a man who is most dear to me, chased around the city, and my heart laments," or, "Woe is me, that Sharpedon, who is most dear to me, should be fated to be killed by Patroclus, the son of Monoetius." If our young people at Amanthus listen to these stories without ridiculing them as not worth hearing, it's hardly likely that they'll consider the things described in them to be unworthy of mere human beings like themselves, or that they'll rebuke themselves for doing or saying similar things when misfortune strikes. Instead, they'll feel neither shame nor restraint, but groan and lament at even insignificant misfortunes. What you say is completely true. Then, as the argument has demonstrated, and we must remain persuaded by it until someone shows us a better one, they mustn't behave like that. No, they mustn't. Moreover, they mustn't be lovers of laughter either. For, whenever anyone indulges in violent laughter, a violent change of mood is to follow. So I believe. Then, if someone represents worthwhile people as overcome by laughter, we won't approve, and we'll approve even less if they represent gods that way. Much less. Then we won't approve of Homer saying things like this about the gods. "And unquenchable laughter arose among the blessed gods as they saw Hephaestus limping through the hall." According to your argument, such things must be rejected, if you want to call it mine, but they must be rejected in any case. Moreover, we have to be concerned about truth as well, for if what we said just now is correct, and falsehood, though of no use to the gods, is useful to people as a form of drug, clearly we must allow only doctors to use it, not private citizens. Clearly. Then, if it is appropriate for anyone to use falsehoods for the good of the city, because of the actions of either enemies or citizens, it is the rulers. But everyone else must keep away from them, because for a private citizen to lie to a ruler is just as bad a mistake as for a sick person or athlete not to tell the truth to his doctor or trainer about his physical condition, or for a sailor not to tell the captain the facts about his own condition, or that of the ship and the rest of its crew. Indeed, it is a worse mistake than either of these. That's completely true. And if the ruler catches someone else telling falsehoods in the city, any one of the craftsmen, whether a prophet, a doctor who heals the sick, or a maker of spears, he'll punish him for introducing something as subversive and destructive to a city as it would be to a ship. He will, if practice is to follow theory. What about moderation? Won't our young people also need that? Of course. And aren't these the most important aspects of moderation for the majority of people, namely, to obey the rulers and to rule the pleasures of drink, sex, and food for themselves? That's my opinion at any rate. Then we'll say that the words of Homer's Diomedes are well put. Sit down in silence, my friend, and be persuaded by me. And so is what follows. The Achaeans, breathing eagerness for battle, marched in silence, fearing their commanders. And all other such things. Those are well put. But what about this? Wine-bibber with the eyes of a dog and the heart of a deer. And the rest is it, or any other headstrong words spoken in prose or poetry by private citizens against their rulers? Well put? No, they aren't. I don't think they are suitable for young people to hear, not in any case with a view to making them moderate, though it isn't surprising that they are pleasing enough in other ways. What do you think? The same as you. What about making the cleverest man say that the finest thing of all is when the tables are well laden with bread and meat, and the wine-bearer draws wine from the mixing bowl and pours it in the cups, or death by starvation is the most pitiful fate? Do you think that such things make for self-controlling young people? Or what about having Zeus, when all the other gods are asleep and he alone is awake, easily forget all his plans because of sexual desire, and be so overcome by the sight of Hera that he doesn't even want to go inside but wants to possess her there on the ground, saying that his desire for her is even greater than it was when, without their parents' knowledge, they were first lovers? Or what about the chaining together of Ares and Aphrodite by Hephaestus, also the result of sexual passion? No, by God, none of that seems suitable to me. But if, on the other hand, there are words or deeds of famous men who are exhibiting endurance in the face of everything, surely they must be seen or heard. For example, he struck his chest and spoke to his heart, "Endure, my heart, you've suffered more shameful things than this." They certainly must. Now, we mustn't allow our men to be money lovers or to be bribable with gifts. Certainly not. Then the poets mustn't sing to them, "Gifts persuade gods and gifts persuade revered kings." Nor must Phoenix, the tutor of Achilles, be praised as speaking with moderation when he advises him to take the gifts and defend the Achaeans, but not to give up his anger without gifts. Nor should we think such things to be worthy of Achilles himself. Nor should we agree that he was such a money lover that he would accept the gifts of Agamemnon, or release the corpse of Hector for a ransom, but not otherwise. It certainly isn't right to praise such things. It is only out of respect for Homer, indeed, that I hesitate to say that it is positively impious to accuse Achilles of such things, or to believe others who say them, or to make him address Apollo in these words: "You've inspired me, far shooter, most deadly of the gods, and I'd punish you if I had the power." Or to say that he disobeyed the river, a god, and was ready to fight it, or that he consecrated hair to the dead Patroclus, which was already consecrated to a different river, Spercheius. It isn't to be believed that he did any of these, nor is it true that he dragged the dead Hector around the tomb of Patroclus, or massacred the captives on his pyre. So we'll deny that. Nor will we allow our people to believe that Achilles, who was the son of a goddess and of Peleus, the most moderate of men and the grandson of Zeus, and who was brought up by the most wise Chiron, was so full of inner turmoil as to have two diseases in his soul: slavishness accompanied by the love of money on the one hand, and arrogance towards gods and humans on the other. That's right. We certainly won't believe such things, nor will we allow it to be said that Theseus, the son of Poseidon, and Pirithous, the son of Zeus, engaged in terrible kidnappings, or that any other hero and son of a god dared to do any of the terrible and impious deeds that they are now falsely said to have done. We'll compel the poets either to deny that the heroes did such things, or else to deny that they were children of the gods. They mustn't say both, or attempt to persuade our young people that the gods bring about evil, or that heroes are no better than humans. As we said earlier, these things are both impious and untrue, for we demonstrated that it is impossible for the gods to produce bad things. Of course. Moreover, these stories are harmful to people who hear them, for everyone will be ready to excuse himself when he's bad, if he is persuaded that similar things both are being done now and have been done in the past by close descendants of the gods, those near to Zeus, to whom belongs the ancestral altar high up on Mount Ida, in whom the blood of daemons has not weakened. For that reason we must put a stop to such stories, lest they produce in the young a strong inclination to do bad things. Absolutely. So far the argument has been confined to the poets' treatment of gods and heroes. Similar rules cannot be laid down for the treatment of men until justice has been defined. Now, isn't there a kind of story whose content we haven't yet discussed? So far we've said how one should speak about gods, heroes, daemons, and things in Hades. We have. Then what's left is how to deal with stories about human beings, isn't it? Obviously. But we can't settle that matter at present. Why not? Because I think we'll say that what poets and prose writers tell us about the most important matters concerning human beings is bad. They say that many unjust people are happy and many just ones wretched, that injustice is profitable if it escapes detection, and that justice is another's good, but one's own loss. I think we'll prohibit these stories and order the poets to compose the opposite kind of poetry and tell the opposite kind of tales. Don't you think so? I know so. But if you agree that what I said is correct, couldn't I reply that you've agreed to the very point that is in question in our whole discussion? And you'd be right to make that reply. Then we'll agree about what stories should be told about human beings only when we've discovered what sort of thing justice is, and how by nature it profits the one who has it, whether he is believed to be just or not. That's very true. So that there was the first part. I'm just going to see if anything's going on in the chat. Everyone's okay there. So yes, that was Plato's discussion of the formal education and the poetic side. So they were all quotes, I believe, from either Homer or Hesiod. I don't know exactly, but I believe, like I mentioned in one of the commentaries in Book 2, in Plato's time there was no Bible, and so they looked to the poets for their moral and ethical and theological education and teachings. And yeah, before we get back to it, we're going to move on to the formal requirements of the Guardians now. And if you want to support me here at Book Club, the easiest way would be to share this link far and wide on your social medias. I'd appreciate that very much. And make sure you're subscribed if you're not already, so we can carry on with the Plato study of the Republic together. So now we move on to the formal requirements. Plato turns from content to form. He classes poetry according to the degree to which it employs what we should call direct speech, as opposed to indirect speech and narrative. Direct speech involves what he calls representation, that is, it requires the poet or narrator to put himself in the position of the character speaking, think his thoughts, and feel his feelings. Plato objects to this on the grounds that he does not want his guardians to deviate from their own character by representing other characters, especially bad characters. If the discussion seems at times to us academic, we should remember that the Greek schoolboy, when reciting Homer, was expected to throw himself into the story and deliver the speeches with the tones and gestures of an actor, and that it is to such imaginative identification, and therefore to any use of the drama in education, that Plato, rightly or wrongly, objects. This concludes our discussion of the content of stories. We should now, I think, investigate their style, for we'll then have fully investigated both what should be said and how it should be said. I don't understand what you mean, Adamanthus responded. But you must, I said. Maybe you'll understand it better if I put it this way. Isn't everything said by poets and storytellers a narrative about past, present, or future events? What else could it be? And aren't these narratives either narrative alone or narrative through imitation, or both? I need a clearer understanding of that as well. I seem to be a ridiculously unclear teacher. So like those who are incompetent at speaking, I won't try to deal with the matter as a whole, but I'll take up a part and use it as an example to make plain what I want to say. Tell me, do you know the beginning of the Iliad, where the poet tells us that Chryses begs Agamemnon to release his daughter, that Agamemnon harshly rejects him, and that, having failed, Chryses prays to the god against the Achaeans? I do know. You know, then, that up to the lines, and he begged all the Achaeans, but especially the 2 sons of Atreus, the commanders of the army. The poet himself is speaking and doesn't attempt to get us to think that the speaker is someone other than himself. After this, however, he speaks as if he were Chryses, Chryses, and tries as far as possible to make us think that the speaker isn't Homer, but the priest himself, an old man. And he composes pretty well all the rest of his narrative about events in Troy, Ithaca, and the whole Odyssey in this way. That's right. Now, the speeches he makes and the parts between them are both narrative, of course. But when he makes a speech as if he were someone else, won't we say that he makes his own style as much like that of the indicated speaker as possible? We certainly will. Now, to make oneself like someone else in voice or appearance is to imitate the person one makes oneself like. Certainly. In these passages, then, it seems that he and the other poets affect their narrative through imitation. That's right. If the poet never hid himself, the whole of his poem would be narrative without imitation. In order to prevent you from saying again that you don't understand, I'll show you what this would be like. If Homer said that Chryses came with a ransom for his daughter to supplicate the Achaeans, especially the kings, and after that didn't speak as if he had become Chryses, but still as Homer, there would be no imitation, but rather simple narrative. It would have gone something like this: I'll speak without meter, since I'm no poet. And the priest came and prayed that the gods would allow them to capture Troy and be safe afterwards, that they'd accept the ransom and free his daughter, and thus show reverence for the god. When he had said this, the others showed their respect for the priest and consented. But Agamemnon was angry and ordered him to leave and never to return, lest his priestly wand and the wreaths of the god should fail to protect him. He said that before freeing the daughter he'd grow old in Argos by her side. He told Chryses to go away and not to make him angry if he wanted to get home safely. When the old man heard this, he was frightened and went off in silence. But when he had left the camp, he prayed at length to Apollo, calling him by his various titles and reminding him of his own services to him. If any of those services had been found pleasing, whether it was the building of temples or the sacrifice of victims, he asked in return that the arrows of the gods should make the Achaeans pay for his tears. That is the way we get simple narrative without imitation. So there Plato is sort of criticizing and critiquing Homer, the great poet. I understand. Then also understand that the opposite occurs when one omits the words between the speeches and leaves the speeches by themselves. I understand that too. Tragedies are like that. That's absolutely right. And now I think that I can make clear to you what I couldn't before. One kind of poetry and storytelling employs only imitation, tragedy and comedy, as you say. Another kind employs only narration by the poet himself. You find this most of all in the dithyrambs. A third kind uses both, as in epic poetry and many other places, if you follow me. Now I understand what you were trying to say. Remember, too, that before all that we said, that we had dealt with what must be said in stories. I think I'll say that again because I'm not sure I got it. Remember, too, that before all that we said, that we had dealt with what must be said in stories, but that we had yet to investigate how it must be said? Yes, I remember. Well, this, more precisely, is what I meant. We need to come to an agreement about whether we'll allow poets to narrate through imitation, and if so, whether they are to imitate some things but not others, and what things these are, or whether they are not to imitate at all. I divine that you're looking into the question of whether or not we'll allow tragedy and comedy into our city. Perhaps, and perhaps even more than that, for I myself really don't know yet, but whatever direction the argument blows us, that's where we must go. Fine. Then consider, Adamanthus, whether our guardians should be imitators or not. Or does this also follow from our earlier statement that each individual would do a fine job of one occupation, not of many, and that if he tried the latter and dabbled in many things, he'd surely fail to achieve distinction in any of them? He would indeed. Then doesn't the same argument also hold for imitation? A single individual can't imitate many things as well as he can imitate one. No, he can't. Then he'll hardly be able to pursue any worthwhile way of life, while at the same time imitating many things and being an imitator. Even in the case of two kinds of imitation that are thought to be closely akin, such as tragedy and comedy, the same people aren't able to do both of them well. Did you not just say that these were both imitations? I did, and you're quite right that the same people can't do both. Nor can they be both rhapsodies and actors. True. Indeed, not even the same actors are used for tragedy and comedy. Yet all these are imitations, aren't they? They are. And human nature, Adamanthus, seems to me to be minted in even smaller coins than these, so that it can neither imitate many things well, nor do the actions themselves, of which those imitations are likenesses. That's absolutely true. Then, if we're to preserve our first argument, that our guardians must be kept away from all other crafts, so as to be the craftsmen of the city's freedom, and be exclusively that, and do nothing at all except what contributes to it, they must neither do nor imitate anything else. If they do imitate, they must imitate from childhood what is appropriate for them, namely, people who are courageous, self-controlled, pious, and free, and their actions. They mustn't be clever at doing or imitating slavish or shameful actions, lest, from enjoying the imitation, they come to enjoy the reality. Or haven't you noticed that imitations practiced from youth become part of nature and settle into habits of gesture, voice, and thought? I have indeed. Then we won't allow those for whom we profess to care, and who must grow into good men, to imitate either a young man, a young woman, or an older one. Then we won't allow those for whom we profess to care and who must grow into good men to imitate either young women or an older one, or one abusing her husband, quarrelling with the gods, or bragging because she thinks herself happy, or one suffering misfortune and possessed by sorrows and lamentations, and even less one who is ill, in love, or in labor. That's absolutely right. Nor must they imitate either male or female slaves doing slavish things. No, they mustn't. Nor bad men, it seems, who are cowards and are doing the opposite of what we described earlier, namely, libeling and ridiculing each other, using shameful language while drunk or sober, or wronging themselves and others, whether in word or deed, in the various other ways that are typical of such people. They mustn't become accustomed to making themselves like madmen in either word or deed, for, though they must know about mad and vicious men and women, they must neither do nor imitate anything they do. That's absolutely true. Should they imitate metal workers or other craftsmen, or those who row in triremes, or their timekeepers, or anything else connected with ships? How could they, since they aren't to concern themselves with any of those occupations? And what about this? Will they imitate neighing horses, bellowing bulls, roaring rivers, the crashing sea, thunder, or anything of that sort? They are forbidden to be mad or to imitate mad people. If I understand what you mean, there is one kind of style and narrative that someone who is really a gentleman would use whenever he wanted to narrate something, and another kind, unlike this one, which his opposite by nature and education would favour, and in which he would narrate. Which styles are those? Well, I think that when a moderate man comes upon the words or actions of a good man in his narrative, he'll be willing to report them as if he were that man himself, and he won't be ashamed of that kind of imitation. He'll imitate this good man most when he's acting in a faultless and intelligent manner, but he'll do so less and with more reluctance when the good man is upset by disease, sexual passion, drunkenness, or some other misfortune. When he comes upon a character unworthy of himself, however, he'll be unwilling to make himself seriously resemble that inferior character, except, perhaps, for a brief period in which he's doing something good. Rather, he'll be ashamed to do something like that, both because he's unpractised in the imitation of such people, and because he can't stand to shape and mould himself according to a worse pattern. He despises this in his mind, unless it's just done in play. Now, excuse me a moment, my the browser's crashed with the stream, but I think it should be okay. But I just want to get it back up. I'm stressing out the system with it's still live, which is all I want to see. I'm stressing my poor MacBook Air with all this streaming and pages and I don't know if you can hear the whirring. Okay, I think we're back. We're back. That seems likely. He'll therefore use the kind of narrative we described in dealing with the Homeric epics a moment ago. His style will participate both in imitation and in the other kind of narrative, but there'll be only a little bit of imitation in a long story. Or is there nothing in what I say? That's precisely how the pattern for such a speaker must be. As for someone who is not of this sort, the more inferior he is, the more willing he'll be to narrate anything, and to consider nothing unworthy of himself. As a result, he'll undertake to imitate seriously, and before a large audience, all the things we just mentioned: thunder, the sounds of the wind, hail, axles, pulleys, trumpets, flutes, pipes, and all the other instruments, even the cries of dogs, sheep, and birds. And this man's style will consist entirely of imitation in voice and gesture, or else include only a small bit of plain narrative. That too is certain. These, then, are the two kinds of style I was talking about. There are these two. The first of these styles involves little variation, so that if someone provides a musical mode and rhythm appropriate to it, won't the one who speaks correctly remain, with a few minor changes, pretty well within that mode and rhythm throughout? That's precisely what he'll do. What about the other kind of style? Doesn't it require the opposite if it is to speak appropriately, namely, all kinds of musical modes and all kinds of rhythms, because it contains every type of variation? That's exactly right. Do all poets and speakers adopt one or other of these patterns of style, or a mixture of both? Necessarily. What are we to do then? Shall we admit all these into our city, only one of the pure kinds, or the mixed one? If my opinion is to prevail, we'll admit only the pure imitator of a decent person. And yet, Adamanthus, the mixed style is pleasant. Indeed, it is by far the most pleasing to children, their tutors, and the vast majority of people. Yes, it is the most pleasing. But perhaps you don't think that it harmonizes with our constitution, because no one in our city is two or more people simultaneously, since each does only one job. Indeed, it doesn't harmonize. And isn't it because of this that it's only in our city that we'll find a cobbler who is a cobbler and not also a captain along with his cobbling, and a farmer who is a farmer and not also a juror along with his farming, and a soldier who is a soldier and not a money maker in addition to his soldiering, and so with them all? That's true. It seems then that if a man who through clever training can become anything and imitate anything should arrive in our city wanting to give a performance of his poems, we should bow down before him as someone holy, wonderful, and pleasing. But we should tell him that there is no one like him in our city, and that it isn't lawful for there to be. We should pour myrrh on his head, crown him with wreaths, and send him away to another city. But for our own good, we ourselves should employ a more austere and less pleasure-giving poet and storyteller, one who would imitate the speech of a decent person, and who would tell his stories in accordance with the patterns we laid down when we first undertook the education of our soldiers. That is certainly what we'd do if it were up to us. It's likely, then, that we have now completed our discussion of the part of music and poetry that concerns speech and stories, for we've spoken both of what is to be said and of how it is to be said. I agree. The musical requirements. Music is dealt with on a similar basis. Greek music was employed largely as an accompaniment to song, and what this section is concerned to say is that, having laid down rules governing the content and form of poetry, we must now require their musical accompaniment to be appropriate. As appears from the text, the Greeks recognized several types or styles of music, and were inclined to associate them with different types of feeling and character, an association made by both Plato and Aristotle. So particular varieties of the Lydian style were regarded as mournful, the Ionian style as relaxing, the Dorian and Phrygian as expressing courage and self-control. but the technicalities of Greek music are not easy to understand. Doesn't it remain then to discuss lyric odes and songs? Clearly. And couldn't anyone discover what we would say about them, given that it has to be in tune with what we've already said? Glaucon laughed and said, "I'm afraid, Socrates, that I'm not to be included under anyone, for I don't have a good enough idea at the moment of what we're to say. Of course I have my suspicions." "Nonetheless," I said, "you know that, in the first place, a song consists of 3 elements: words, harmonic mode, and rhythm." "Yes, I do know that. As far as words are concerned, they are no different in songs than they are when not set to music, so mustn't they conform in the same way to the patterns we established just now?" "They must. Further, the mode and rhythm must fit the words." "Of course. And we said that we no longer needed dirges and lamentations among our words." "We did indeed." "What are the lamenting modes then? You tell me, since you're musical." "The Mixolydian, the Syntono-Lydian, and some others of that sort." "Aren't they to be excluded then? They're useless even to decent women, let alone to men." "Certainly. Drunkenness, softness, and idleness are also most inappropriate for our guardians." "How could they not be?" "What then are the soft modes suitable for drinking parties?" "The Ionian and those Lydian modes that are said to be relaxed." "Could you ever use those to make people warriors?" "Never. And now all you have left is the Dorian and Phrygian modes." "I don't know all the musical modes. Just leave me the mode that would suitably imitate the tone and rhythm of a courageous person who is active in battle or doing other violent deeds, or who is failing and facing wounds, death, or some other misfortune, and who, in all these circumstances, is fighting off his fate steadily and with self-control. Leave me also another mode, that of someone engaged in a peaceful, unforced, voluntary action, persuading someone or asking a favor of a god in prayer, or of a human being through teaching and exhortation, or, on the other hand, of someone submitting to the supplications of another who is teaching him and trying to get him to change his mind, and who, in all these circumstances, is acting with moderation and self-control, not with arrogance, but with understanding, and is content with the outcome. Leave me, then, these 2 modes which will best imitate the violent or voluntary tones of voice, and those who are moderate and courageous, whether in good fortune or in bad. The modes you're asking for are the very ones I mentioned. Well then, we'll have no need for polyharmonic or multi-stringed instruments to accompany our odes and songs. It doesn't seem so to me, at least. Then we won't need the craftsmen who make triangular lutes, harps, and all other such multi-stringed and polyharmonic instruments. Apparently not. What about flute makers and flute players? Will you allow them into the city? Or isn't the flute the most many-stringed of all? And aren't the panharmonic instruments all imitations of it? Clearly. The lyre and the kithara are left then, as useful in the city, while in the country there'd be some sort of pipe for the shepherds to play. That is what our argument shows, at least. Well, we certainly aren't doing anything new in preferring Apollo and his instruments to Marsyas and his. By God, it doesn't seem as though we are. And, by the dog, without being aware of it, we've been purifying the city we recently said was luxurious. That's because we're being moderate. Then let's purify the rest. The next topic after musical modes is the regulation of meter. We shouldn't strive to have either subtlety or great variety in meter. Rather, we should try to discover what are the rhythms of someone who leads an ordered and courageous life, and then adapt the meter and the tune to his words, not his words to them. What these rhythms actually are is for you to say, just as in the case of the modes. I really don't know what to say. I can tell you from observation that there are three basic kinds of metrical feet, out of which the others are constructed, just as there are four in the case of modes. But I can't tell you which sort imitates which sort of life. Then we'll consult with Damon as to which metrical feet are suited to slavishness, insolence, madness, and the other vices, and which are suited to their opposites. I think I've heard him talking about enopleon, which is a composite metrical phrase, although I'm not clear on this, and also about daclitic or heroic meter, which he arranged, I don't know how, to be equal up and down in the interchange of long and short. I think he called 1 foot and iambus, another a trochee, assigning a long and a short to both of them. In the case of some of these, I think he approved or disapproved of the tempo of the foot as much as of the rhythm itself, or of some combination of the two. I can't tell you which, but, as I said, we'll leave these things to Damon, since to mark off the different kinds would require a long argument. Or do you think we should try it? No, I certainly don't. The summary of this section. Plato proceeds to sum up the general purpose of this stage of education, to train both character and moral and aesthetic judgment, the last two being closely allied. The influence of environment on growing minds is emphasized. It is because of this that so rigid a control of the music and poetry to be used in education is required. Mathematics and, so far as it then existed, scientific training is reserved for a later stage of the guardian's education, but a reference there to introducing arithmetic and geometry in childhood shows that though no reference is made to them here, some mathematics is to be studied at this earlier stage. But you can discern, can't you, that grace and gracelessness follow good and bad rhythm respectively? Of course. Further, if, as we said just now, rhythm and mode must conform to the words and not vice versa, then good rhythm follows fine words and is similar to them, while bad rhythm follows the opposite kind of words, and the same for harmony and disharmony. To be sure, these things must conform to the words. What about the style and content of the words themselves? Don't they conform to the character of the speaker's soul? Of course. And the rest conform to the words? Yes. Then fine words, harmony, grace, and rhythm follow simplicity of character. And I do not mean this in the sense in which we use simplicity as a euphemism for simple-mindedness, but I mean the sort of fine and good character that has developed in accordance with an intelligent plan. That's absolutely certain. And must not our young people everywhere aim at these if they are to do their own work? They must indeed. Now, surely painting is full of these qualities, as are all the crafts similar to it. Weaving is full of them, and so are embroidery, architecture, and the crafts that produce all the other furnishings. Our bodily nature is full of them, as are the natures of all growing things, for in all of these there is grace and gracelessness. And gracelessness, bad rhythm, and disharmony are akin to bad words and bad character, while their opposites are akin to and are imitations of the opposite, a moderate and good character. Absolutely. It is, then, only poets we have to supervise, compelling them to make an image of a good character in their poems, or else not to compose them among us. Or are we also to give orders to other craftsmen, forbidding them to represent, whether in pictures, buildings, or any other works, a character that is vicious, unrestrained, slavish, and graceless? Are we to allow someone who cannot follow these instructions to work among us, so that our guardians will be brought up on images of evil, as if in a meadow of bad grass, where they crop and graze in many different places every day until, little by little, they unwittingly accumulate a large evil in their souls? Or must we rather seek out Or must we rather seek out craftsmen who are by nature able to pursue what is fine and graceful in their work, so that our young people will live in a healthy place and be benefited on all sides, and so that something of those fine works will strike their eyes and ears like a breeze that brings health from a good place, leading them unwittingly from childhood on to resemblance, friendship, and harmony with the beauty of reason? The latter would be by far the best education for them. Aren't these the reasons, Glaucon, that education in music and poetry is most important? First, because rhythm and harmony permeate the inner part of the soul more than anything else, affecting it most strongly and bringing it grace, so that if someone is properly educated in music and poetry, it makes him graceful, but if not, then the opposite. Second, because anyone who has been properly educated in music and poetry will sense it acutely when something has been omitted from a thing and when it hasn't been finely crafted or finely made by nature. And since he has the right distastes, he'll praise fine things, be pleased by them, receive them into his soul, and being nurtured by them, become fine and good. He'll rightly object to what is shameful, hating it while he's still young and unable to grasp the reason, but having been educated in this way, he will welcome the reason when it comes and recognize it easily because of its kinship with himself. Yes, I agree that those are the reasons to provide education in music and poetry. It's just the way it was with learning how to read. Our ability wasn't adequate until we realized that there are only a few letters that occur in all sorts of different combinations, and that, whether written large or small, they were worthy of our attention, so that we picked them out eagerly wherever they occurred, knowing that we wouldn't be competent readers until we knew our letters. True. And isn't it also true that if there are images of letters reflected in mirrors or water, we won't know them until we know the letters themselves, for both abilities are parts of the same craft and discipline? Absolutely. Then, by the gods, am I not right in saying that neither we nor the guardians we are raising will be educated in music and poetry until we know the different forms of moderation, courage, frankness, high-mindedness, and all their kindred, and their opposites too, which are moving around everywhere, and see them in the things in which they are, both themselves and their images, and do not disregard them, whether they are written on small things or large, but accept that the knowledge of both large and small letters is part of the same craft and discipline? That's absolutely essential. Therefore, if someone's soul has a fine and beautiful character, and his body matches it in beauty and is thus in harmony with it, so that both share in the same pattern, wouldn't that be the most beautiful sight for anyone who has eyes to see? It certainly would. And isn't what is most beautiful also most lovable? Of course. And a musical person would love such people most of all, but he wouldn't love anyone who lacked harmony. No, he wouldn't. At least not if the defect was in the soul, but if it was only in the body, he'd put up with it and be willing to embrace the boy who had it. I gather that you love or have loved such a boy yourself, and I agree with you. Tell me this, however. Is excessive pleasure compatible with moderation? How can it be, since it drives one mad just as much as pain does? What about with the rest of virtue? No. Well then, is it compatible with violence and licentiousness? Very much so. Can you think of a greater or keener pleasure than sexual pleasure? I can't, or a madder one either. But the right kind of love is by nature the love of order and beauty that has been moderated by education in music and poetry. That's right. Therefore, the right kind of love has nothing mad or licentious about it. No, it hasn't. Then sexual pleasure mustn't come into it, and the lover and the boy he loves must have no share in it, if they are to love and be loved in the right way. By God, no, Socrates, it mustn't come into it. It seems, then, that you'll lay it down as a law in the city we're establishing, that if a lover can persuade a boy to let him, then he may kiss him, be with him and touch him, as a father would a son, for the sake of what is fine and beautiful. But, turning to the other things, his association with the one he cares about must never seem to go on any further than this. Otherwise he will be reproached as untrained in music and poetry and lacking in appreciation for what is fine and beautiful. That's right. Does it seem to you that we've now completed our account of education in music and poetry? Anyway, it has ended where it ought to end, for it ought to end in the love of the fine and beautiful. I agree. So they were the sections on poetry and music, and how the guardians and rulers should be educated. And next we're going to move on to physical education, and there'll be a part about the physical education, and I'll give you a brief summary. Hello there, Green Grapes, Nearveer and BR. I'm doing very well, thank you. And so yeah, we'll move on to physical education next. And I'll just say before we go there, if you would be interested in discussing the ideas and concepts we find in Plato's Republic, or in any books that I've read, or any philosophical or religious ideas that you're interested in, you can head over to the Patreon book club community and book syllabus. The link's in the description. And yeah, we can communicate there privately. And you can also gain access to the reading syllabus that I've created, which, yeah, if you want to know some great books to read in order to benefit and develop your life, you can go there and, yeah, follow the syllabus and support me. And as I often say, the best way to support and the easiest would be sharing this link far and wide to, yeah, increase exposure and allow other people to come in. But now, back to the dialogue. Physical education. Plato does not go into detail, but makes it clear that he is thinking of a military rather than an athletic training, which is why, perhaps, he tends to regard it, as appears later, as a stage of education lasting approximately from the 18th to the 20th year, rather than as something which accompanies the secondary education which he has just finished describing. Young men at Athens, in fact, spent 2 years from 18 to 20 doing a course of compulsory military training, and it is of military training as much as of physical education in our sense that Plato is thinking. The passage proceeds to criticize certain developments of contemporary medicine of which Plato disapproved, and more briefly, to condemn litigiousness. It ends by emphasizing that physical, and much as literary, education is aimed primarily at the development of character. After music and poetry, our young people must be given physical training. Of course. In this too they must have careful education from childhood throughout life. The matter stands, I believe, something like this, but you too should look into it. It seems to me that a fit body doesn't by its own virtue make the soul good, but instead that the opposite is true. A good soul by its own virtue makes the body as good as possible. How does it seem to you? The same. Then, if we have devoted sufficient care to the mind, wouldn't we be right, in order to avoid having to do too much talking, to entrust it with the detailed supervision of the body, while we indicate only the general patterns to be followed? Certainly. We said that our prospective guardians must avoid drunkenness, for it is less appropriate for a guardian to be drunk and not to know where on earth he is. Sorry, I'll start that again. We said that our prospective guardians must avoid drunkenness, for it is less appropriate for a guardian to be drunk and not to know where on earth he is than it is for anyone else. It would be absurd for a guardian to need a guardian. What about food? Aren't these men athletes in the greatest contest? They are. Then would the regimen currently prescribed for athletes in training be suitable for them? Perhaps it would. Yet it seems to result in sluggishness and to be of doubtful value for health. Or haven't you noticed that these athletes sleep their lives away, and that, if they deviate even a little from their orderly regimen, they become seriously and violently ill? I have noticed that. Then our warrior athletes need a more sophisticated kind of training. They must be like sleepless hounds, able to see and hear as keenly as possible, and to endure frequent changes of water and food, as well as summer and winter weather on their campaigns without faltering in health. That's how it seems to me too. Now, isn't the best physical training akin to the simple music and poetry we were describing a moment ago? How do you mean? I mean a simple and decent physical training, particularly the kind involved in training for war. What would it be like? You might learn about such things from Homer. You know that, when his heroes are campaigning, he doesn't give them fish to banquet on, even though they are by the sea in the Hellesport, nor boiled meat either. Instead, he gives them only roasted meat, which is the kind most easily available to soldiers, for it's easier nearly everywhere to use fire alone than to carry pots and pans. That's right. Nor, I believe, does Homer mention sweet desserts anywhere. Indeed, aren't even the other athletes aware that, if one's body is to be sound, one must keep away from all such things? They're right to be aware of it, at any rate, and to avoid such things. If you think that, then it seems that you don't approve of Syracusan cuisine or of Sicilian-style dishes. I do not. Then you also object to Corinthian girlfriends for men who are to be in good physical condition? Absolutely. What about the reputed delights of Attic pastries? I certainly object to them too. I believe that we'd be right to compare this diet and this entire lifestyle to the kinds of lyric odes and songs that are composed in all sorts of modes and rhythms. Certainly. Just as embellishment in the one gives rise to licentiousness, doesn't it give rise to illness in the other? But simplicity in music and poetry makes for moderation in the soul, and in physical training it makes for bodily health? That's absolutely true. And as licentiousness and disease breed in the city, aren't many law courts and hospitals opened? And don't medicine and law give themselves solemn airs when even large numbers of free men take them very seriously? How could it be otherwise? Yet could you find a greater sign of bad and shameful education in a city than that the need for skilled doctors and lawyers is felt not only by inferior people and craftsmen, but those who claim to have been brought up in the manner of free men? Don't you think it shameful and a great sign of vulgarity to be forced to make use of a justice imposed by others as masters and judges because you are unable to deal with the situation yourself? I think that's the most shameful thing of all. Yet isn't it even more shameful when someone not only spends a good part of his life in court defending himself or prosecuting someone else, but, through inexperience of what is fine, is persuaded to take pride in being clever at doing injustice and then exploiting every loophole and trick to escape conviction, and all for the sake of little worthless things, and because he's ignorant of how much better and finer it is to arrange one's own life so as to have no need of finding a sleepy or inattentive judge. This case is even more shameful than the other. And doesn't it seem shameful to you to need medical help, not for wounds or because of some seasonal illness, but because through idleness and the lifestyle we've described, one is full of gas and phlegm like a stagnant swamp, so that sophisticated Asclepiad doctors are forced to come up with names like flatulence and catarrh to describe one's diseases? It does. And those certainly are strange new names for diseases. Indeed, I don't suppose that they even existed in the time of Asclepius himself. I take it as a proof that I take it as a proof of this that his sons at Troy didn't criticize either the woman who treated Eurypylus when he was wounded, or Patroclus, who prescribed the treatment which consisted of Pramnian wine with barley meal and grated cheese sprinkled on it, though such treatment is now thought to cause inflammation. That funny phrase there. And grated cheese sprinkled on it. I'm sure we've all experienced grated cheese on our pasta or whatever, but I don't know why that's so funny for me, why that's tickled me so much. Grated cheese. Simple things please simple minds, eh? Sorry, back to the text. Yet it's a strange drink to give someone in that condition. Not if you recall that they say that the kind of modern medicine that plays nursemaid to the disease wasn't used by the Asclepiads before Herodicus. He was a physical trainer who became ill, so he mixed physical training with medicine and wore out first himself and then many others as well. How did he do that? By making his dying a lengthy process, always tending his mortal illness. He was, nonetheless, it seems, unable to cure it, so he lived out his life under medical treatment, with no leisure for anything else whatever. If he departed even a little from his accustomed regimen, he became completely worn out, but because his skill made dying difficult, he lived into an old age. That's a fine price for his skill. One that's appropriate for someone who didn't know that it wasn't because he was ignorant or inexperienced that Asclepius failed to teach this type of medicine to his sons, but because he knew that everyone in a well-regulated city has his own work to do, and that no one has the leisure to be ill and under treatment all his life. It's absurd that we recognize this to be true of craftsmen, while failing to recognize that it's equally true of those who are wealthy and supposedly happy. How is that? When a carpenter is ill, he expects to receive an emetic, or a purge from his doctor, or to get rid of his disease through surgery or cautery. If anyone prescribed a lengthy regimen to him, telling him that he should rest with his head bandaged and so on, he'd soon reply that he had no leisure to be ill, and that life is no use to him if he has to neglect his work and always be concerned with his illness. After that he'd bid good-bye to his doctor, resume his usual way of life, and either recover his ill health, or, if his body couldn't withstand the illness, he'd die and escape his troubles. It is believed to be appropriate for someone like that to use medicine in this way. Is it because his life is of no profit to him if he doesn't do his work? Obviously. But the rich person, we say, has no work that would make his life unlivable if he couldn't do it. That's what people say, at least. That's because you haven't heard the saying of Phoclides that, once you have the means of life, you must practice virtue. I think he must also practice virtue before that. We won't quarrel with Phoclides about this, but let's try to find out whether the rich person must indeed practice virtue, and whether his life is not worth living if he doesn't, or whether tending an illness, while it is an obstacle to applying oneself to carpentry and the other crafts, is no obstacle whatever to taking Phoclides' advice. I think that's how you pronounce it, Phoclides. That's what I'm going for. But excessive care of the body over and above physical training is pretty well the biggest obstacle of all. It's troublesome in managing a household, in military service, and even in a sedentary public office. Yet the most important of all, surely, is that it makes any kind of learning, thought, or private meditation difficult, for it's always imagining some headaches or dizziness and accusing philosophy of causing them. Hence, wherever this kind of virtue is practised and examined, excessive care of the body hinders it, for it makes a person think he is ill, and be all the time concerned about his body. It probably does. Therefore, won't we say that Asclepius knew this, and that he taught medicine for those whose bodies are healthy in their natures and habits but have some specific disease? His medicine is for these people with these habits. He cured them of their disease with drugs or surgery, and then ordered them to live their usual life, so as not to harm their city's affairs. But for those whose bodies were riddled with disease, he didn't attempt to prescribe a regimen, drawing off a little here and pouring in a little there, in order to make their life a prolonged misery and enable them to produce offspring in all probability like themselves. He didn't think that he should treat someone who couldn't live a normal life, since such a person would be of no profit, either to himself or to the city. The Asclepius you're talking about was quite a statesman, clearly. And don't you see that because he was a statesman, his sons turned out to be good men at Troy, practicing medicine as I say they did? Don't you remember that they Don't you remember that they sucked out the blood and applied gentle potions to the wound Pandarus inflicted on Menelaus, but without prescribing what he should eat or drink after that, any more than they did for Eurypylus? They considered their drugs to be sufficient to cure men who were healthy and living an orderly life before being wounded, even if they happened to drink wine mixed with barley and cheese right after receiving their wounds. But they didn't consider the lives of those who were by nature sick and licentious to be profitable either to themselves or to anyone else. Medicine isn't intended for such people, and they shouldn't be treated, not even if they're richer than Midas. The sons of Asclepius you're talking about were indeed very sophisticated. Appropriately so, but Pindar and the tragedians didn't agree with us. They say that Asclepius was the son of Apollo, that he was bribed with gold to heal a rich man who was already dying, and that he was killed by lightning for doing so. But in view of what we said before, we won't believe this. We'll say that if Asclepius was the son of a god, he was not a money grubber, and that if he was a money grubber, he was not the son of a god. That's right. But what do you say about the following, Socrates? Don't we need to have good doctors in our city? And the best will surely be those who have handled the greatest number of sick and of healthy people. In the same way, the best judges will be those who have associated with people whose natures are of every kind. I agree that the doctors and judges must be good, but do you know the I agree that the doctors and judges must be good, but do you know the kind I consider to be so? If you'll tell me. I'll try. But you ask about things that aren't alike in the same question. In what way? The cleverest doctors are those who, in addition to learning their craft, have had contact with the greatest number of very sick bodies from childhood on, have themselves experienced every illness, and aren't very healthy by nature. For they don't treat bodies with their bodies, I suppose. If they did, we wouldn't allow their bodies to be or become bad. Rather, they treat the body with their souls, and it is possible for the soul to treat anything well if it is or has been bad itself. It isn't possible for the soul to treat anything well if it is or has been bad itself. That's right. As for the judge, he does rule other souls with his own soul. And it isn't possible for a soul to be nurtured among vicious souls from childhood, to associate with them, to indulge in every kind of injustice, and come through it able to judge other people's injustices from its own case, as it can diseases of the body. Rather, if it's to be fine and good and a sound judge of just things, it must itself remain pure and have no experience of bad character while it is young. That's the reason, indeed, that decent people appear simple and easily deceived by unjust ones when they are young. It's because they have no models in themselves of the evil experiences of the vicious to guide their judgments. That's certainly so. Therefore, a good judge must not be a young person, but an old one, who has learned late in life what injustice is like, and who has become aware of it, not as something at home in his own soul, but as something alien and present in others, someone who after a long time has recognized that injustice is bad by nature, not from his own experience of it, but through knowledge. Such a judge would be the most noble one of all. And he'd be good too, which was what you asked, for someone who has a good soul is good. The clever and suspicious person, on the other hand, who has committed many injustices himself and thinks himself a wise villain, appears clever in the company of those like himself, because he's on his guard and is guided by the modes within himself. But when he meets with good older people, he's seen to be stupid, distrustful at the wrong time, and ignorant of what a sound character is, since he has no model of this within himself. But since he meets vicious people more often than good ones, he seems to be clever rather than unlearned, both to himself and to others. That's completely true. Then we mustn't look for the good judge among people like that, but among the sort we described earlier. A vicious person would never know either himself or a virtuous one, whereas a naturally virtuous person, when educated, will in time acquire knowledge of both virtue and vice. And it is someone like that who becomes wise, in my view, and not the bad person. I agree with you. Then won't you legislate in our city for the kind of medicine we mentioned, and for this kind of judging, so that together they look after those who are naturally well endowed in body and soul? But as for the ones whose bodies are naturally unhealthy, or whose souls are incurably evil, won't they let the former die of their own accord, and put the latter to death? That seems to be best for the ones who suffer such treatment, and for the city. However, our young people, since they practice that simple sort of music and poetry that we said produces moderation, will plainly be wary of coming to need a judge. That's right. And won't a person who's educated in music and poetry pursue physical training in the same way, and choose to make no use of medicine except when unavoidable? I believe so. He'll work at physical exercises in order to arouse the spirited part of his nature, rather than to acquire the physical strength for which other athletes diet and labour. That's absolutely right. Then, Glaucon, did those who established education in music and poetry and in physical training do so with the aim that people attribute to them, which is to take care of the body with the latter and the soul with the former, or with some other aim? What other aim do you mean? It looks as though they established both chiefly for the sake of the soul. How so? Haven't you noticed the effect that lifelong physical training, unaccompanied by any training in music and poetry, has on the mind, or the effect of the opposite, music and poetry without physical training? What effects are you talking about? Savagery and toughness. Savagery and toughness in the one case, and softness and over-cultivation in the other. I get the point. You mean that those who devote themselves exclusively to physical training turn out to be more savage than they should, while those who devote themselves to music and poetry turn out to be softer than is good for them? Moreover, the source of the savageness in the spirited part of one's nature. Rightly nurtured, it becomes courageous, but if it is overstrained, it's likely to become hard and harsh. So it seems. And isn't it the philosophic part of one's nature that provides the cultivation? If it is relaxed too far, it becomes softer than it should, but if properly nurtured, it is cultivated and orderly. So it is. Now, we say that our guardians must have both these natures. They must indeed. And mustn't the two be harmonized with each other? Of course. And if this harmony is achieved, the soul is both moderate and courageous? Certainly. But if it is inharmonious, it is cowardly and savage. Yes, indeed. Therefore, when someone gives music an opportunity to charm his soul with the flute and to pour those sweet, soft and plaintive tunes we mentioned through his ear, as through a funnel, when he spends his whole life humming them and delighting in them, then, at first, whatever spirit he has is softened, just as iron is tempered, and from being hard and useless it is made useful. But if he keeps at it unrelenting and is beguiled by the music, after a time his spirit is melted and dissolved until it vanishes, and the very sinews of his soul are cut out, and he becomes a feeble warrior. That's right. And if he had a spiritless nature from the first, this process is soon completed. But if he had a And if he had a spiritless nature from the first, this process is soon completed. But if he had a spirited nature, his spirit becomes weak and unstable, flaring up at trifles and extinguished as easily. The result is that such people become quick-tempered, prone to anger, and filled with discontent rather than the spirited. That's certainly true. What about someone who works hard at physical training and eats well, but never touches music or philosophy? Isn't he in good physical condition at first, full of resolution and spirit? And doesn't he become more courageous than he was before? Certainly. But what happens if he does nothing else and never associates with the muse? Doesn't whatever love of learning he might have had in his soul soon become enfeebled, deaf and blind, because he never tastes any learning or investigation, or partakes of any discussion or any of the rest of music and poetry to nurture or arouse it? It does seem to be that way. I believe that someone like that becomes a hater of reason and of music. He no longer makes any use of persuasion, but bulls his way through every situation by force and savagery, like a wild animal, living in ignorance and stupidity, without either rhythm or grace. That's most certainly how he'll live. It seems then that a God has given music and physical training to human beings not, except incidentally, for the body and the soul, but for the spirited and wisdom-loving parts of the soul itself, in order that these might be in harmony with one another, each being stretched and relaxed to the appropriate degree. It seems so. Then the person who achieves the finest blend of music and physical training and impresses it on his soul in the most measured way is the one we'd most correctly call completely harmonious and trained in music, much more so than the one who merely harmonizes the strings of his instrument. That's certainly so, Socrates. Then won't we always need this sort of person as an overseer in our city, Glaucon, if indeed its constitution is to be preserved? It seems that we'll need someone like that most of all. And now we come to a portion or a part about the guardians and auxiliaries specifically, and then we move on shortly after to the rulers and auxiliaries' way of life. So yeah, we still have a few pages to go of book 3, but like I say, now we move on specifically about the guardians and auxiliaries themselves. Before we were still discussing how they should be educated, but now we come to guardians and auxiliaries. And be sure to like the video, subscribe and support in all the various ways. I'd appreciate that very much. Guardians and auxiliaries, the three classes and their mutual relations. The guardian class is subdivided into guardians proper or rulers and auxiliaries. The rulers exercise supreme authority in the state and are selected by exacting tests. The auxiliaries discharge military, police and executive duties under the orders of the rulers. Everything which the rulers do is done for the good of the community. Plato sketches a foundation myth and stringently requires that children are to be moved from class to class according to merit and capability. He does not give details which might have been difficult to work out, but there is no reason to doubt his seriousness. Plato has been criticized for his foundation myth as if it were a calculated lie, but the myth is accepted in all three classes, guardians included. It is meant to replace the national traditions which any community has, which are intended to express the kind of community it is, or wishes to be, its ideals, rather than to state matters of fact. And one of Plato's own criticisms of democracy was that its politicians constantly mislead it, governing by propaganda rather than reason. And I'll just come back to the full screen to make a few points there. I believe, if I remember rightly, that this myth talks about the gold souls, silver souls, and bronze souls, I think, or maybe that comes later on, but that's what I think this myth is. And also there you read about, and one of Plato's own criticisms of democracy was that its politicians constantly mislead it, governing by propaganda rather than reason. And so I'll just ask you to consider briefly what your rulers rule with. Do they rule with reason or with propaganda? And I mean, that's a bit of a rhetorical question. I mean, I think I know the answer, but it's so interesting for me how far our leaders are from philosopher kings. The examples of philosopher kings we have in the culture are nowhere near. They're not the rulers, and they probably wouldn't be interested in ruling because they have that sort of soul, that character. And then the rulers, they rule by propaganda and selfishness. But anyway, that's my 2 cents worth, if you don't mind. And now back to the dialogue, and I believe we come to this myth about the different sorts of souls, but I may be wrong. Let's see. These then are the patterns for education and upbringing. Should we enumerate the dances of these people, or their hunts, chases with hounds, athletic contests, and horse races? Surely they're no longer hard to discover, since it's pretty clear that they must follow the patterns we've already established. Perhaps so. All right then, what's the next thing we have to determine? Isn't it which of these same people will rule and which will be ruled? Of course. Now, isn't it obvious that the rulers must be older than the ruled younger? Yes, it is. And mustn't the rulers also be the best of them? That too. That too. And aren't the best farmers the ones who are best at farming? Yes. Then, as the rulers must be the best of the guardians, mustn't they be the ones who are the best at guarding the city? Yes. Then, in the first place, mustn't they be knowledgeable and capable, and mustn't they care for the city? That's right. Now, one cares most for what one loves, necessarily. And someone loves something most of all when he believes that the same things are advantageous to it as to himself, and supposes that if it does well, he'll do well, and that if it does badly, then he'll do badly too. That's right. Then we must choose from among our guardians those men who, upon examination, seem most of all to believe throughout their lives that they must eagerly pursue what is advantageous to the city and be wholly unwilling to do the opposite. Such people would be suitable for the job at any rate. I think we must observe them at all ages to see whether they are guardians of this conviction, and make sure that neither compulsion nor magic spells will get them to discard or forget their belief that they must do what is best for the city. What do you mean by discarding? I'll tell you. I think the discarding of a belief is either voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary when one learns that the belief is false, involuntary in the case of all true beliefs. I understand voluntary discarding, but not involuntary. What's that? Don't you know that people are voluntarily deprived of bad things, but involuntarily deprived of good ones? And isn't being deceived about the truth a bad thing, while possessing the truth is good? Or don't you think that to believe the things that are is to possess the truth? That's right. and I do think that people are involuntarily deprived of true opinions. But can't they also be deprived of theft, magic spells, and compulsions? I think I missed that one word there. But can't they also be so deprived by theft, magic spells, and compulsion? Now I don't understand again. I'm afraid I must be talking like a tragic poet. By the victims of theft, I mean those who are persuaded to change their minds, or those who forget because time in the latter case and argument in the former takes away their opinions about their realizing it, without their realizing it. Do you understand now? Yes. By the compelled, I mean those whom pain or suffering causes to change their mind. I understand that and think you're right. The victims of magic, I think you'd agree, are those who change their mind because they are under the spell of pleasure or fear. It seems to me that everything that deceives does so by casting a spell. Then, as I said just now, we must find out who are the best guardians of their conviction that they must always do what they believe to be best for the city. We must keep them under observation from childhood and set them tasks that are most likely to make them forget such a conviction or be deceived out of it, and we must select whoever keeps on remembering it and isn't easily deceived and reject the others. Do you agree? Yes. And we must subject them to labours, pains, and contests in which we can watch for these traits. That's right. Then we must also set up a competition for the third way in which people are deprived of their convictions, namely magic. Like those who lead cults into noise and tumult to see if they're afraid, we must expose our young people to fears and pleasures, testing them more thoroughly than gold is tested by fire. If someone is hard to put under a spell, is apparently gracious in everything, and is a good guardian for himself and the music and poetry he has learned, and if he always shows himself to be rhythmical and harmonious, then he is the best person, both for himself and for the city. Anyone who is tested in this way as a child, youth, and adult, and always comes out of it untainted, is to be made a ruler as well as a guardian. He is to be honoured in life, and to receive after his death the most prized tombs and memorials, but anyone who fails to prove himself in this way is to be rejected. It seems to me, Glaucon, that rulers and guardians must be selected and appointed in some such way as this, though we've provided only a general pattern and not the exact details. It also seems to me that they must be selected in this sort of way. Then isn't it truly most correct to call these people complete guardians, since they will guard against external enemies and internal friends, so that the one will lack the power and the other the desire to harm the city? The young people we've hitherto called guardians will now call auxiliaries and supporters of the guardians' convictions. I agree. Now then, could we devise one of those I agree. How, then, could we devise one of those useful falsehoods we were talking about a while ago? One noble falsehood that would, in the best case, persuade even the rulers, but if that's not possible, then the others in the city. What sort of falsehood? Nothing new, but a Phoenician story, which describes something that has happened in many places. At least, that's what the poets say, and they've persuaded many people to believe it too. It hasn't happened among us, and I don't even know if it could. It would certainly take a lot of persuasion to get people to believe it. You seem hesitant to tell the story. You seem hesitant to tell the story. When you hear it, you'll realize that I have every reason to hesitate. Speak, and don't be afraid. I'll tell it then, though I don't know where I'll get the audacity or even the words I'll use. I'll tell it then, though I don't know where I'll get the audacity or even what words I'll use. I'll first try to persuade the rulers and the soldiers and then the rest of the city that the upbringing and the education we gave them and the experiences that went with them were a sort of dream, that in fact they themselves, their weapons, and the other craftsmen tools, were at that time really being fashioned and nurtured inside the earth, and that when the work was completed, the earth, who is their mother, delivered all of them up into the world. Therefore, if anyone attacks the land in which they live, they must plan on its behalf and defend it as their mother, and nurse and think of the other citizens, their earth-born brothers. It isn't for nothing that you were so shy about telling your falsehood. Appropriately so. Nevertheless, listen to the rest of the story. All of you in the city are brothers, we'll say to them in telling our story. But the God who made you mixed some gold into those who are adequately equipped to rule, because they are most valuable. He put silver in those who are auxiliaries, and iron and bronze in the farmers and other craftsmen. For the most part you will produce children like yourselves, but, because you are all related, a silver child will occasionally be born from a golden parent, and vice versa, and all the others from each other. So the first and most important command from the God to the rulers is that there is nothing that they must guard better or watch more carefully than the mixture of metals in the souls of the next generation. If an offspring of theirs should be found to have a mixture of iron or bronze, they must not pity him in any way, but give him the rank appropriate to his nature and drive him out to join the craftsmen and farmers. But if an offspring of these people is found to have a mixture of gold or silver, they will honor him and take him up to join the guardians or the auxiliaries. For there is an oracle which says that the city will be ruined if it ever has an iron or a bronze guardian. So, do you have any device that will make our citizens believe this story? I can't see any way to make them believe it themselves, but perhaps there is one in the case of their sons and later generations, and all the other people who come after them. I understand pretty much what you mean, but even that would help to make them care more for the city and I understand pretty much what you mean, but even that would help to make them care for the city and each other. And now we come to the final, the rulers and auxiliaries' ways of life. And like I said, that was the myth I was thinking of about the different levels of souls. And hello, Brother Lee. It's lovely to see you, and I hope you'll be going back over all of the books in order to, better acquaint yourself with the Republic. And here we have the rulers and auxiliaries' way of life. The rulers and auxiliaries are to live a life of austere simplicity, without private property or family life. For private property was, Plato thought, the chief temptation that led men to sacrifice public to personal interests. The happiness of both will lie in their service to the community, for it is the happiness of the community as a whole, and not of any particular class, that is the objective. And if I could just give you my 2 cents worth again, the current rulers of the countries that we all live in, much of what they do in their position of power is for their own interests, if not currently at the present time, then at least with the foresight that after they leave office, they will be benefited personally. So this is a very interesting point that the translator of the Penguin Classic Edition is making, and I think it's a very fair point. But back to the dialogue, we have just a couple of pages left to read. However, let's leave this matter wherever tradition takes it, and let's now arm our earth-born and lead them forth with their rulers in charge. And as they march, let them look for the best place in the city to have their camp, a site from which they can most easily control those within, if anyone is unwilling to obey the laws or repel any outside enemy who comes like a wolf upon the flock. And when they have established their camp and made the requisite sacrifices, they must see to their sleeping quarters. What do you say? I agree. And won't these quarters protect them adequately, both in winter and summer? Of course, for it seems to me that you mean their housing. Yes, but housing for soldiers, not for money makers. How do you mean to distinguish these from one another? I'll try to tell you. The most terrible and most shameful thing of all is for a shepherd to rear dogs as auxiliaries to help him with his flock in such a way that, through licentiousness, hunger, or some other bad trait of character, they do evil to the sheep and become like wolves instead of dogs. That's certainly a terrible thing. Isn't it necessary, therefore, to guard in every way against our auxiliaries doing anything like that to the citizens, because they are stronger, thereby becoming savage masters instead of kindly allies? It is necessary. And wouldn't a really good education endow them with the greatest caution in this regard? But surely they have had an education like that. Perhaps we shouldn't assert this dogmatically, Glaucon. What we can assert is what we were saying just now, that they must have the right education, whatever it is, if they are to have what will most make them gentle to each other and to those they are guarding. That's right. Now, someone with some understanding might say that, besides this education, they must also have the kind of housing and other property that will neither prevent them from being the best guardians nor encourage them to do evil to the other citizens. That's true. Consider then whether or not they should live in some such way as this, if they're to be the kind of men we described. First, none of them should possess any private property beyond what is wholly necessary. Second, none of them should have a house or storeroom that isn't open for all to enter at will. Third, whatever sustenance moderate and courageous warrior athletes require in order to have neither shortfall nor surplus in a given year, they'll receive by taxation on the other citizens as a salary for their guardianship. Fourth, they'll have common messes to live together like soldiers in a camp. We'll tell them that they always have gold and silver of a divine sort in their souls as a gift from the gods, and so have no further need of human gold. Indeed, we'll tell them that it's impious for them to defile this divine possession by any admixture of such gold, because many impious deeds have been done that involve the currency used by ordinary people, while their own is pure. Hence, for them alone among the city's population, it is unlawful to touch or handle gold or silver. They mustn't be under the same roof as it, wear it as jewelry, or drink from gold or silver goblets. In this way they'd save both themselves and the city. But if they acquire private land, houses, and currency themselves, they'll be household managers and farmers instead of guardians, hostile masters of the other citizens instead of their allies. They'll spend their whole lives hating and being hated, plotting and being plotted against, more afraid of internal than external enemies, and they'll hasten both themselves and the whole city to almost immediate ruin. For all these reasons, let's say that the guardians must be provided with housing and the rest in this way, and establish this as a law. Or don't you agree? I certainly do, Glaucon said. And that concludes Book 3 of Plato's Republic. And of course, next comes Book 4, and I'll hope to have that for you next Thursday. Like I say, we've done this reading a bit early, one day early, because I'm away for the Easter weekend. But yes, I hope you enjoyed Plato's Republic Book 3. Like I say, it's very interesting. He's just developing this idea of a city, and then of the guardians, rulers, and auxiliaries. And there we've just learned the way of lives, the guardians and auxiliaries, the rulers' way of life. And he's just said that they shouldn't have any private property. They should all share their dwellings in common, so that they have only thoughts of the city in mind and not their own personal benefit and wealth development. So it's very interesting ideas, and soon we will come to later on in the Republic, the most famous sections are the simile of the sun and the cave, arguably, and at the end, the fates, the morae and the fates. So just to look at the chat quickly, a very good Easter to yourself too, Peter Lee and Tyler Murdy. Hello and goodbye at the same time, because we're just finishing up book 3 now, and book 4 will be coming very soon. So be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. Have a great Easter weekend, everyone, and I'll see you all very soon. So look after yourselves, take care, and bye for now. See you.